आप सभी को नमस्कार। हिंदी विभाग हैदराबाद विश्वविद्यालय और आई प्रोजेक्ट के इस अंतर्राष्ट्रीय संगोष्ठी के पहले दिन के दूसरे सत्र में मैं सेतु कुमार वर्मा आप सबका स्वागत करता हूं। इस सत्र का शीर्षक है औपनिवेशिक प्रतिबंध, कॉलोनियल प्रिस्क्रिप्शन। और इस सत्र में हमारे साथ जो वक्ता जुड़े हैं, जो वो साहित्य, समाज, कला, शासन, इन सब के पूरे वाइड रेंज को कवर करते हुए मुझे लगता है कि बहुत गहरी बातचीत हमारे साथ होगी और हम सब उसको सुनकर बहुत कुछ सीखने का मौका मिलेगा। मैं अपने सभी वक्ताओं को मंच पर एक एक करके बुलाना चाहूँगा और सबसे पहले जो हमारी आज की मुख्य वक्ता हैं वो हैं डॉक्टर इजाबेल बहुआ ओलेंसो। मैम जो हैं सहायक प्रोफेसर हैं मध्य पूर्वी, दक्षिणी एशियाई और अफ्रीकी अध्ययन, कोलंबिया विश्वविद्यालय न्यूयॉर्क की। और मैम का काम जो है वो भारत और पाकिस्तान के कॉलोनियल और पोस्ट कॉलोनियल हिस्ट्री के ऊपर काम है मुख्य रूप से। इनकी जो अभी जो इससे पहले सत्र में उन्होंने प्रेजेंट किया वो रेडियो, यहाँ के रेडियो के ऊपर था। और इनका जो इतिहास, किस तरीके से कॉलोनियल इतिहास ने इन दो देशों को प्रभावित किया है, उसके ऊपर इन्होंने बहुत गहरा अध्ययन किया है। और हम बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं मैम डॉक्टर इजाबेल बहुआ ओलेंसो। मैम प्लीज कम एंड टेक योर सीट। आप लोग ताली बजाकर इनका स्वागत कीजिए। हमारे दूसरे वक्ता यहाँ हैदराबाद विश्वविद्यालय के फोकलोर डिपार्टमेंट के डॉक्टर जॉली बुद्धुसेरी सर हैं। और सर का काम मुख्य रूप से सर फोकलोर डिपार्टमेंट से है, लेकिन थिएटर से बहुत गहराई से जुड़े हुए हैं। और थिएटर, फोकलोर, फोक आर्ट किस तरीके से हमारे समाज, हमारे कल्चर और हमारी साइकी से जुड़ा हुआ है, उसको देखते हुए और किस तरीके से जो इतिहास है वो उसके साथ डील करता है, इन सारी चीज़ों को सर का अध्ययन सर ने किया है। और सर का हम बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं कि सर आप मंच पर आएँ और अपना स्थान ग्रहण करें। कृपया तालियों से स्वागत करें। हमारे तीसरे वक्ता हैं डॉक्टर प्रभात कुमार। डॉक्टर प्रभात कुमार सहायक प्रोफेसर है एस.ड दिल्ली से। उनका काम, उनका पीएचडी जो है वो कार्टून के ऊपर है, हिंदी कार्टून के ऊपर है, जो कि बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग होगा सुनना। और आज के समय में निश्चित रूप से और भी ज़्यादा इंटरेस्टिंग हो सकता है, क्योंकि कार्टून एक ऐसी विधा है जो लोगों को मनोरंजित भी करती है और उद्वेलित भी करती है। तो हम बहुत कुछ सुनना, उस विषय में भी अगर आपसे थोड़ा बहुत बात कर पाए तो अच्छा लगेगा सुनकर। उसके साथ साथ सर हिंदी का जो बौद्धिक इतिहास है उसके ऊपर सर का काम है। तो हम आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं सर, आप आएँ और अपनी बात हमारे साथ रखें। हमारी जो चौथी वक्ता हैं डॉक्टर प्रज्ञा सिंह गुप्ता, जो एसयू की ही एलुमनाई हैं और उनको यहाँ वापस देखकर हमें बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है। जो कुछ पुराने लोग हैं उनको पहचान रहे हैं। और प्रज्ञा सिंह गुप्ता जी का मुख्य रूप से जो काम है वो राजवंशी जो समुदाय है उसके फोकलोर के ऊपर में इनका काम रहा है। और ये जो इनका पीएचडी का काम जो है वो ट्रांसलेशन एज एन एक्ट एंड आर्ट ऑफ रीडिंग। और इन सारी बातों को और जो यहाँ पे उनका विषय है वो प्रतिबंधित बंगाली कविता के अनुवाद के ऊपर अनुवाद है, जो काजी नजरुल इस्लाम जिन्होंने बहुत गहराई से लिखा है, उनके ऊपर प्रेजेंट करेंगे। तो मैं आपका स्वागत करता हूँ हिंदी विभाग की तरफ से। और इस सत्र की अध्यक्षता करने के लिए हम सबके प्रिय, जिनको शायद हम नाम से नहीं जानते हों, लेकिन हम उनकी अगर हम हिंदी के विद्यार्थी हैं, अगर हम मैगजीन पढ़ते हैं तो उनके चित्र को हमने किसी न किसी मैगजीन के कवर पर देखा होगा। और उस बहाने से भले हम आर्टिस्ट को न देखे हों, लेकिन उनकी कला को जरूर देख कर गुजर जाते हैं। और ऐसे ही कलाकार हैं हमारे इस सत्र के अध्यक्ष श्री अशोक भौमिक सर। आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है सर। अपनी कला के कलाकार होने के साथ साथ कला के आलोचक भी हैं और इन सब चीज़ों पे बात करते हुए और इस सत्र की अध्यक्षता के लिए हम आपका स्वागत करते हैं। और समय ना लेते हुए ज़्यादा समय ना लेते हुए मैं अपने इस सत्र के पहली वक्ता डॉक्टर इजाबेला मैम को बुलाता हूँ और अपनी बात रखता हूँ। थैंक यू।
Namaskar and thank you again. So in the previous talk, I wasn't able to play some recordings, and I thought I should play them because we can't have a talk about radio with more radio recordings. So I wanted to play just a short recording of Subhash Chandra Bose's speech from he was broadcasting from Singapore, and this is actually a speech that was caught in video. But he did the same speech later on the radio, so it would have sounded very similar. So while this is not the original speech, it's no longer available, this is very similar to what it would have been like to listen and to talk about him afterwards. So I wanted to make sure I played.
Our countrymen and our sisters and brothers at home have been doing their best in the set of distance in which they are placed. But the enemy is ruthless and desperate, and he is armed with peace. Against such a brutal foe, no amount of civil disobedience or of sabotage or of revolutionary terrorism can be of any avail. Therefore, we want to expel British power from India. We have to fight the enemy with his own weapons. The enemy has already drawn the sword. He must therefore be fought with the sword. But it is not possible for our countrymen at home to organize an armed revolution and to fight the British army of occupation with borders armed. Hindisahityakaitihas must therefore involve on Indians living abroad and particularly on Indians living in Asia. Then, if you compare the history of our national struggle with the history of similar struggles in other parts of the world, you will realize that we in India have lacked one thing and one thing alone. We lack the strength and organization whereby we can meet war with war. I am confident that with the help of my countrymen in Asia, I shall be able to organize such a gigantic force and will be able to sweep away the British power of India in conjunction with those who have already been fighting at home. Our nation and every patriotic Indian must advance towards the kingdom battle. Only then the blood of freedom-loving Indians begins to flow will India attain freedom.
So a couple of things I want to mention about this speech, which is the quality would have been similar and listening would have been an experience of struggling. So it's not listening to perfect radio broadcast, but struggling with that. The second one that I want to mention is the context in which Subhash Chandra Bose's speech is circulated, which was in the context of Axis propaganda to India, which were speeches that would have been heard alongside support for Hitler and for Japan during World War II. And his voice was heard within that context. And the context that you hear of asking for blood was actually not only the context of Gandhi's asking for blood during 1942, but also the context of Axis broadcast propaganda that emphasized similar forms of it. And I wanted us to hear it because I think any lecturer in radio has to make sure that we pay attention to it. And in the book, I try to put that in the context of both neither idolizing Subhash Chandra Bose's voice, nor actually, but at the same time seeing it critically within the context of what it meant to listen to radio at the time period, as well as reading it forward and how this use of radio resonance continues to exist even in the 1950s and the 1960s afterwards. So that's the end of the talk that I was unable to have. So now, because they're really making me work, as I told Ravikan, and now I have for this particular talk. So I'm going to be talking today about two radio stations, Radio Sec and Congress Radio, also known as Underground Congress Radio, and SEC is Southeast Asia Command. And these are two stations that seem to be very different and completely unrelated. And yet, I hope to convince you today that the radio stations actually have more in common than might be initially apparent. And most importantly, I hope to convince you that reading them together, we can more productively understand the Second World War's effects on radio infrastructures and listening cultures in South Asia, particularly given that this is a conference that focuses on late colonial India. So what I'm going to present is a forthcoming article. It's not yet published. It's separate from the book, from Modern Asian Studies by the same title than the talk. But I want to say that the article is not sort of just me alone. It's part of a larger special issue that studies the Second World War in South Asia, and is co-edited by me and my colleague Andrew Amstutz, and it includes articles by several other colleagues working on the same topic. And part of what we're arguing together is that a history of World War II is incomplete without looking at the history of late colonial India. And we're arguing that alongside a number of Indian and Pakistani scholars that have done that. And we're also arguing, though, that a history of the late colonial period and a history of nationalism is incomplete without the study of the Second World War. And the study of Radio Sec that I'm going to talk to you about is one that we often don't hear because World War II is pushed to the background to emphasize the nationalist movement. So I want to argue that it has to be part of the story as well. So just to begin, Radio Sec was a military radio station based in the Crown Colony of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, whose broadcast targeted British soldiers stationed in Asia during the waning years of the Second World War. And the station was the acronym of Southeast Asia Command, SEAC. But it actually technically targeted British soldiers. This was exclusively for English-speaking British soldiers in Southeast Asia as well as India. The Indian military commands. And the station housed a powerful wide-reaching transmitter, which the British government had ordered directly from the Macaroni Company in 1944. It is said to be, and there's no way to prove it, among the most powerful in the world at the time, in terms of how wide-reaching it was. And it was in the hopes of providing access to entertaining radio programs to lift the spirits, to make soldiers feel better, that were stationed in the East and help sway the war in Britain's favor. Let's remember that in the by 1944, it certainly looked like Japan was going to win the war, right? So, now the second station that I'm going to study, Congress Radio, is a makeshift station in Bombay, relying on a low-power transmitter that could only reach a few neighborhoods in the city of Bombay. It was run by a small group of young and enthusiastic anti-colonial activists with no prior broadcasting experience. Frustrated with the censored print media, which I mentioned in the previous talk, motivated by Gandhi's famous call for the British to quit India, and likely also inspired by the growing popularity of German and Japanese radio stations broadcasting then in Indian languages, primarily in Hindustani, but in a number of other languages as well, this young group of people took to the airwaves. And the station was on the air for a little bit longer than 2 months in 1942, in the summer. So I want to use these two radio stations to rethink some foundational theories regarding colonialism and technology and how they work. So clearly Radio Sec and Congress Radio operated on vastly different scales and had rival goals. Their political ambitions and staging of technology, the article will demonstrate, however, were a bit similar. We can say that Radio Sec sought to restore confidence in the empire during a moment of crisis. I mean, 1944, Britain is losing the war, the empire is falling apart. Using an old device of imperialism, the colonial sublime, The colonial sublime is the use of technology to represent an overwhelming sense of grandeur and awe in the service of colonial power, according a term that Brian Larkin uses. Focusing on Nigeria, he argues that British mastery of technology was part of the conceptual promise of colonialism and its self-justification, the freeing of natives from superstitious belief by offering them universalizing world of science. So expanding on Larkin's findings in my analysis of Radio Sec, which remember, it was aimed at British soldiers, I demonstrate how the colonial sublime was not only directed at colonized populations, but was also tried to use to reassure a dispirited British population, in this case British soldiers, that the empire was still on. But if the colonial sublime was an effort by colonialists to use the technology as evidence of supremacy of European civilization, then the makeshift underground radio station turned that idea on its head. By using technological innovation against the colonial rulers, these amateur broadcasters sought to summon what we might call the anti-colonial sublime. So Madhu Limaye, am I pronouncing correct? Limaye? Limaye. A writer and anti-colonial activist active during the Quit India Uprising alluded to the power of the anti-colonial sublime when describing Congress radio. These broadcasts were indistinct. They could have not damaged the government very much, but the Congress radio was his challenge to its authority and prestige. So the analysis of these two stations together allows us to rethink how the medium of radio connects with audiences. British administrators tried to reestablish faith in the empire less through the content of Radio 6, right? What they were saying was less important than through the aura of technological grandeur that administrators hoped the military station transmitter would give, lauded among the best in the world. Similarly, Congress radio's influence had less to do with the actual broadcast content than with the air of insubordination the station's presence on the airwaves conveyed, regardless of how limited its reach was and how few people could tune in. So here it's important to note that during World War II, the radio had become a vital technology, critical both in military and civilian contexts, and broadcasting acquired an important symbolic value. To command the airways was to command power. So now I want to flesh out a bit more by retelling the stories of these two radio stations. So let's begin with the Radio Sec. The story of Radio Sec begins with a series of newspaper reports about declining morale of British soldiers stationed in Asia during World War II. And perhaps unsurprisingly, these reports were not less concerned with the living conditions of Indian and African soldiers fighting for Britain. Because as Yasmin Khan has famously shown, it was the British Empire that fought the war, not the British. In response, the government sent a special investigation on the morale of these British soldiers. Earl Munster to conduct an official investigation and concluded that the situation was dire. His recommendations included, he concluded they had very low morale, improving medical facilities, increasing beer ratios, and third, ensuring that they had access to better radio programs. British forces in South and Southeast Asia, he reported, needed their own radio service. So in November of 1944, when the war's end is still far from felt, at least felt to people out there, far from them, the office proposed a bold and ambitious and expensive plan, setting up a radio transmitter in India, powerful enough to reach all the British soldiers wherever the war in the East will take them. In the summer of 1945, again unaware of the war's end, the War Office gave the go-ahead for the Macaroni Company to begin assembling an 100K transmitter, ensuring it would be one of the most powerful and expensive transmitters in the world. One individual, famous for his media savviness and for his propensity for showmanship, took on immediate interest in this large-scale radio project. Any guesses who it was? Louis Mountbatten, then the Supreme Commander of the Southeast Asia Command, posing here, and heard about it. And in present day India and Pakistan, Mountbatten is known as the last Viceroy of India. But for our purposes here, it was his prior, lesser-known military appointment that proved most influential. So technically, SEAC included American and British troops, and he was supposed to serve both of them. But American soldiers joked that Mountbatten cared only for British troops, and that SEAC actually stood for Save England's Asian Colonies. Mountbatten had a soft spot for media and publicity, and while in charge of the Royal Navy, Mountbatten had contributed to the making of the film In Which We Serve, which poster is here, which had been loosely based on the Royal Navy's HMS Kelly, which Mountbatten had commanded. So it likely did not come as a surprise to anyone in the British government that when Mountbatten learned about the War's Office's ambitious radio project with its stellar transmitter, he did everything possible to take over the project. One RadioSec engineer pointed out from the very beginning that the project had a very Mountbatten style about it. It was bold, ambitious undertaking costing a lot of money. So when Mountbatten moved to the SEAC headquarters to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, he lobbied very hard to bring the transmitter to Ceylon, instead of Delhi, where it had originally been planned by the War Office. So is that clear? He decided to move the transmitter to Ceylon. Unaware of the nearing end, the War Office made plans to inaugurate the new military station with its state-of-the-art transmitter in Ceylon in 1945. But a number of related hindrances kept setting it back, its arrival in Ceylon, and delaying the station's inauguration. Eager to begin radio programs of some kind for British soldiers, RadioSec staff began broadcasting on low-power transmitters. And without the powerful, awe-inspiring transmitter, RadioSec was a rather mundane military radio station, producing routine programs at the tail end of the global war. This was surely disappointing for Mountbatten. As Larkin notes, unveiling and inauguration ceremonies were important symbolic events when the idea of technology and infrastructure as colonial spectacle could have been most powerfully felt. And here's a picture of Mountbatten speaking to the SEAC soldiers, and you can see the ways in which spectacle is celebrating. He didn't have an opportunity to do that with the transmitter. It was not until May of 1946 when the much awaited Macaroni transmitter finally aired its first broadcast from Ceylon. But in May of 1946, the war was already done for more than a year, and Mountbatten was already making plans to leave the island permanently. Yet the transmitter's reception still managed to make waves. So soldiers and civilians in South and Southeast Asia remarked on its extraordinary clear and static-free transmission and its widespread reception, which reached significantly farther than anticipated and whose transmissions could be heard especially clearly in India and Pakistan. But with the war over and Indian independence, RadioSec could no longer be a symbol of the empire's might. So Ceylon becomes independent in 1948, and despite British officials' reluctance and lots of anxious exchange of letters, they had no choice but to handle the ownership of the powerful transmitter to the new Ceylonese government. Immediately after the transfer of ownership, the Ceylonese government began commercial broadcasting on using the transmitter, and within less than a decade, the Hindi language branch of Radio Ceylon's commercial service gained unprecedented popularity in India and Pakistan through its Hindi film songs, among them Amin Sayani's Natak, which I talked about earlier. Mountbatten could have not possibly known back then, the summer of 1944, that shifting his command from India to Ceylon and lobbying hard to bring the transmitter to the island would have such important consequences for the history of sound and music in the Indian subcontinent. And while scholars have now begun to pay attention to Radio Ceylon's pivotal role in shaping India and Pakistan's popular culture, Among them, Ravikant, the urdugajal who I mentioned, and some of the work I have currently done. Largely absent from this story, however, is how the British administrators' desire to invoke the colonial sublime in the midst of the global war made radio salons' later rise even possible. But if radio's relationship to the colonial sublime was important during World War II, the medium's relationship to the anti-colonial sublime remained equally important at this time period. But to tell the story of Congress radio, we must return to the turning point in the global war, to the summer of 1942, when Japan's string of victories began to break away from the British Empire the illusion of permanence, and to signal to many in India the beginning of an end of colonial rule. Quit India is often studied as an important and high point in the nationalist movement, and indeed it is. But it's also an important and high point in the history of World War II, when it certainly seemed to the world that Japan was going to win the war. On the 8th of August of 1944, as the war reached India's doorstep, Gandhi delivered a speech in Bombay demanding that the British quit India once and for all. And within hours of the speech, the British government had arrested Gandhi and many of the Indian National Congress leaders. A group of college-age Bombay-based friends, inspired by Gandhi's call to action, came up with a bold plan, setting up an underground anti-colonial radio station. The station, they surmised, would air news from the current orisons as they were developing throughout India, bypassing British strict censorship of print media, the kind of censorship that I explained in the previous talk. And the group's interest in radio was born out of thin air, but in the literal rather than the figurative sense. The activists were likely inspired by the growing presence of Indian language access radio broadcasts from Germany and Japan, whose popularity increased during Quit India. The four leading organizers of Congress Radio mentioned here, all were in their 20s, and all four seemed to have belonged to relatively well-off families. None were very well-known activists at the moment, nor did they hold positions in the Indian National Congress or any anti-colonial organization, and none were trained broadcasters or had any significant experience with radio broadcasting. Usha Mehta, a 22-year-old student at the time, took a leading role in the project. In a typical patriarchal light, the judge who later tried Congress radio organizers described Mehta, the only woman in the group, as a lieutenant of her male comrades. Evidence, however, shows that Mehta's part in the project was vital, and that she was one of very few Indian women on the airwaves during World War II. Access radio broadcasts, for the most part, only had men voices, as far as I could tell. And her voice helped the station garner attention. For all technical matters, and I'm going to play a small video, a small broadcast. We'll return to it while this is your fixed. So of course, when I talk about the anti-colonial sublime and technology falls apart, right? That's sort of part of it.
When I was young, I listened to the radio, waiting for my favorite song. On 42, during the Quit India movement in 1942, Usha Mehta was a student of Wilson College, Bombay. She recreated those days for us in this archival recording when she was well over 70 years old.
Just when the end part of it had when the record Vande Mataram was being played, all three doors of our flat were broken open by the police, and in came our technician, Mr. Clinton, and along with a battalion of police. When they heard the record being played, they wanted to know who was doing it. When they were told that it was I who was doing it, they just ordered, stop that record. And I said in an equally firm tone that the record will stop, but you please stand on attention. And they did stand on attention, which made us all very happy, and this made me very happy. And even while doing their duty, they have not become traitors, and they had the love of motherland in their hearts.
The passion of a nation.
This is a retelling. We don't have the original recording of Congress Radio, but this is an original retelling by Usha Mehta herself, which is in a feature done by All India Radio later on. So for all technical matters, for all technical matters, the four young activists relied on Narmiman Ardaban printer, a trained technician and the formal principal of the college. And according to the court findings, unlike all other Congress Radio organizers, Printer joined the group purely for financial motivations. Interestingly, Printer's lack of commitment to the anti-colonial cause will be discussed, which I will discuss in detail, during the trial. And this provided an opportunity for the other broadcasters to celebrate and publicize their patriotism. And I'll also be discussing the Vande Mataram discussion that Usha Mehta notes. There were several other individuals who were involved in the radio station, but who were not tried in court. Among them, the film director, K.A. Abbas, the activist Moinuddin Haris, and a woman later identified as Kosmi Dastur. Nanak Motwani, the director of the Chicago Radio and Telephone Company, helped supply parts for the transmitter and arranged the filming of the All India Radio Congress, which was later broadcast on the radio. And he was arrested and tried with all the four defendants for what he did there. The most interesting, Ram Manohar Lokia, an established socialist congressman, penned some of the Congress radio talks and contributed to the logistics of the setting up the station. So in marked contrast with Radio Sec, which was so immobile, the British government had to, Congress radio broadcasters had to constantly change the address to stop the police from being able to tackle them. So these are the seven different addresses where the radio station had to be. In her account of Congress Radio, Usha Taka provides a thorough account of the station and the contributions of its organizers and broadcasters. She, however, focuses on contributing to the scholarship of Indian nationalism rather than engaging in works on World War II and radio broadcasting. Shifting directions, I want to see the story of Congress Radio alongside Radio Sec in the context of the Second World War as experienced in colonial India. Congress Radio broadcasts always began with the following phrase: "This is Congress Radio calling on 42.34 meters from somewhere in India," followed by a musical rendition of the Urdu language poet Muhammad Iqbal's poem "Sara Yahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara," and always closing with the Bengali poem by Grandmother. And the idea was that if they could not hear or understand, they would be able to recognize. And Congress Radio's primary broadcast language was Hindustani. So in later months, the station also added English translations of broadcasts, but Hindustani remained the main broadcast language of the station. This is not surprising given Gandhi and Congress Radio's support of Hindustani as a national language. But the choice of language Congress Radio also echoed Access Radio's various broadcasts. Congress Radio programming consisted of three main reportings: AIC speeches, political talks, and Quit India news updates. And the broadcast seemed to have included both original recordings featuring congressmen's actual voices as well as transcripts of speeches raised by Congress Radio broadcasters. Congress Radio relied on a very low-power transmitter put together by Printer illegally. And naturally, the transmitter's reception and statistics had severe statistic problems. This is in marked contrast with Radio Sec, whose extraordinary clear reception after the Macaroni's transmitter's late arrival was a source of great pride and had been at the very beginning the crucial to the making of the anti-colonial sublime. The very reason why Mountbatten had been so interested in it. What is noteworthy here is that while the colonial sublime required technologies to work efficiently to impart a feeling of submission and frustration, the anti-colonial sublime did not require such technology effectiveness. Actually, the faulty reception, the inability to hear well, which we hear with Subhash Chandra Bose's speeches as well, the sensational news about Quit India, which were often exaggerated news, the somewhat unpolished addresses, and most importantly, the secret behind the station's whereabouts, and the broadcasters' identities. Usha Mehta never revealed her name on the airwaves. All helped forge an aesthetic of rebelliousness, which was crucial to the radio station. Congress radio's secrecy about the station's whereabouts was necessary for the station's very survival, even if that remained an important part for people to know about the station's presence on the airwaves. They asked listeners to please never reveal the location of the station, but to talk about the radio broadcast that they had on the radio. So while elsewhere, as you know, I employ the concept of radio resonance to account for conversation, rumor, and gossip, and to show how that can expand the reach of radio broadcasts, here I want to show how radio resonance could also work after the station had been shut down. And what my research on Congress radio reveals is that the station became most important after it had shut down, following the trial and the police radio station that had been really well reported, that had became really well known. So immediately after the station's after the AIC, the All India Congress Bulletin announced the station's inauguration, the police began to regularly monitor Congress radio broadcasts. And after integrating the shop attendant about a recent transmitter part purchase, they were able to actually track printer down and ask printer to talk about the station's whereabouts, collaborate with the police, likely in exchange for immunity. And the next day, the police raided the station, arrested Javeri and Usha Mehta while the station was still broadcasting. In an oral interview, Usha Mehta writes that the reason why she had to write her version of the events was because she wanted to correct the many false accounts that glorified her own role and incorrectly claimed that the police had tortured her. I read this as an example to show that her desire to put rumors to rest only demonstrates that the raid and the broadcaster's imprisonment were particularly effective at creating radio resonance and amplifying the radio's message, and that the radio's message actually came about through the police raid and the trial. I'm not going to go into too many details of the trial, but I just want to tell you two things. The government tried the four main organizers and Modwani and the owner of the radio shop for violating the Indian Penal Code and Defense of India rules, which I mentioned earlier. And the trial started in April of 1943, so few months after the British government had crushed the Quit India movement. And the case was heard in a special criminal court for Quit India cases. The three male defendants denied having any connection, and Mehta pleaded guilty, but she refused to deny her association with the station. So I want to mention two things about the trial. First were the extremely long discussions about Printer's motivations and his character in the courtroom. And the extremely long discussions about Printer's motivations and his lack of commitment to the nationalist court actually echoed earlier anti-colonial trials, and in particular the famed revolutionaries Bhagat Singh's trial. Because as scholars have shown, Bhagat's trial and discussions about it played an important role in making him into a national hero. So in the end, it was a trial. The most telling deliberation in the courtroom was about the song Vande Mataram, the one that we heard Usha Mehta speak about. Mehta and her comrades claimed that they were playing Vande Mataram at the exact time when the police entered the apartment. The judge disagreed with the account and argued that the police report noted that Printer had cut the fuse of the transmitter. and that it would have been impossible for the song to be playing when she entered. To which Usha Mehta and her collaborators argued that they cut the transmission, but the gramophone was still playing the record. To which the judge responded that if that was true, then the picture that was taken by the police would show the needle on the record, but the needle is not showing on the record, therefore the song was not playing. So one might ask, why is this important?
Yeah.
Well, in the end, it was about creating the aura of technology that I mentioned that was so important, and ensuring that radio resonance of the radio station continues after the radio station is even on the air. In the end, the judge found Mehta, Kakar, and Javeri guilty of conspiracy to establish and imprison all three of them. Motwani and her colleague were acquitted and were not tried for it. But to end, on the surface, Louis Mountbatten and Usha Mehta had little in common. So Mountbatten was the supreme commander of SEP and the soon-to-be final Viceroy of India. He was also an uncle and mentor to the future Queen of England's husband. And in August of 1979, a member of the Irish Republic Army killed Mountbatten alongside several members of his family to protest Britain's colonial relationship with Ireland. Usha Mehta was a student activist who worked hard in support of the colonial administration's trade policies, in protest of the colonial administration's trade policies. After independence, Mehta completed a PhD and became a university professor, and the Indian government recognized Mehta's anti-colonial activities in 1998. So despite Mountbatten and Mehta's radically different relationship to imperialism, the stories collided during the Second World War, as they both tuned into the medium of radio. Mehta took to the microphone a few months later, before Mountbatten began to lobby to bring the macaroni transmitter to Ceylon. Interestingly, these two individuals from such different walks of life intuitively understood that radio's materiality could convey a powerful message, at times more influential than the broadcast content itself. But if Mountbatten's Radio Sec and Mehta's Congress Radio had similar political ambitions, their projects' outcomes differed. So Radio Sec's transmitter did not reach Radio Ceylon until after the war's end, and the station came far from invoking the colonial sublime in the ways Mountbatten had hoped for, right? And this is the reason why Radio Sec's absence from the historical accounts is because it was a failed scheme. So we don't see it in any histories. Mehta's local and makeshift underground station shut down only 2 months after it went on the air. And by many accounts, it could also be considered an unsuccessful, failed enterprise. But a careful reading of the events reveals that the dramatic police raid and the prolonged court case, its organizers ultimately amplified the Congress Radio message. So while Congress Radio remained a local Bombay project, it very much succeeded in evoking the anti-colonial sublime. Yet, as Thomas Mullany reminds us, we should not focus too much on trying to determine these stations' successes or failures, because technologies need not derive the relevance from the magnitude of their immediate effect, but from the intensity and endurance of the engagement they create. And I think this is critical for all censored and prescribed literature as well. The stories of Radio Sec and Congress Radio, while seemingly have nothing to do with each other and completely unconnected, read alongside one another and focusing on the Second World War and the medium of radio, they can show how, during the Second World War, the medium of radio could simultaneously serve and contest the colonial state. And they demonstrate how the global war set the stage for the enduring rivalry between state-sponsored networks and competing stations in the decades following independence in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Isabella, for such a profound presentation. If I could remember, I got admission in Shillong for my MPhil, and my grandmother said, "Oh, you got admission in Ceylon." So she does not know about Shillong, but she has memory of Radio Ceylon. So that's how it is connected to the older people who have lived through those colonial era, and it was really kind of I felt emotional to know all this background and from where it was being transmitted, and what was the background, like how it's all being done. Thank you so much.